We've already been addressing some of the criticisms about ethnographic research. We've looked at some of the criticisms by considering the dispute between Derek Freeman and Margaret Mead. And what I would like to do now is to direct you to a chapter in a recently published handbook on ethnography in virtual worlds. We will be talking about the new area of virtual ethnography at some stage later on in the course. But right now, what I'd like to do is to walk you through, to talk you through, to take you through one of the chapters in this handbook on ethnography in virtual worlds, which is a new area of anthropology where anthropologists are doing virtual research on gamers, on chat rooms, on all sorts of stuff. And this book is on the Google Drive, and I don't need to give you the link here because I'm sure that you have that all organised now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be taking you to chapter 3, and in chapter 3, after we've gone through the main points, I'm going to go through the PDF with you and to point out some of the points that I found interesting and compelling. Now remember, these people are particularly interested in ethnography in virtual worlds, so some of their examples mightn't be ones that you are familiar with. Some of the main criticisms that they discuss is that one myth is that ethnography is unscientific, and that ethnography is less valid than quantitative research. The third point is that all ethnography is anecdotal. It's anecdotal. Ethnography is undermined by subjectivity. Ethnography is merely intuitive. It's an exercise in stating the obvious, but it's also on feelings too much. And ethnography is writing about your personal experience. The seventh myth is that ethnographers can contaminate field sites by their very presence, which was related to the subjectivity of the fourth myth. And that ethnography is the same as grounded theory. We'll be talking about grounded theory a bit later on in the course, if you are not familiar with that term. Ethnography is the same as ethnomethodology, and lastly, ethnography will soon become obsolete. So let's go to the PDF, and this is not a long article, and I warmly recommend, we're going to go to full screen now. And what I'm going to do is we will start at the front, but I'm going to just take you to some of the sections that personally I found most interesting. So if you'll excuse me, we're going to be playing around with a few different ways of presenting material, and this is the first time that I've walked you through a PDF in this manner. So, ethnography is unscientific because science must test a hypothesis. Science is only concerned with experiments, and science is predicative, and science is quantitative. So these are some common misunderstandings about the nature of science. They are methodologies which are appropriate to specific fields, and our field of anthropology we are interested in different phenomenon, and we need to take different methodologies. Science must test a hypothesis. The hypothesis-driven model of science includes the assumptions that scientists must have an idea about the outcome of their research before they begin. However, while all science methods involve research questions, these questions do not necessarily take the form of a hypothesis. Significantly, ethnography centres on discovery and interpretations. Its questions are formulated to address broad questions of social and cultural life. So, let's just read on. Ethnographers, like historians, must be vulnerable to what is actually happening on the ground. And social scientists have long noted that the potential for emergent research questions makes field-based methods more scientific than less. For what reason? Because the research is directed towards understanding the field site in its historical and geographical specificity. So a limitation of the hypothesis testing paradigm is that it must work within the horizon of the known. When we do not know what we will encounter, we must pursue a different methodology. Let's keep on going down, looking at the main thoughts. While many phenomena are amenable to experimentation, best investigated in controlled traits, culture is not such a phenomenon. We have noted that cultural elements do not easily translate to statements of hypothetical outcomes. In addition, controlled experiments cannot capture the scale, complexity, and flexibility and dynamism of culture. And so this criticism of ethnography being unscientific is a myth, because the phenomenon that we are studying, namely a broad range of cultural and social phenomenon, these are not going to be served by experiments, which are more common in the physical science. A third consideration is that science must be predicative. If we drop a rock today versus 100 years ago into the future, the law of gravity predicts that, all other factors being equal, the rock will make the same amount of time to hit the ground. Human life is subject to the instabilities of historical change. The nature of culture is to be agile and creative in meeting change. Thus, we have two orders of change to predict, each mutually dependent on each other. A very good point made. Essentially, the task of theory building in ethnographic research is not to generalize across case, but to specialize within them. While this notion that ethnographic research is not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive one in search of meaning. Again, that ethnographic research is not an experimental science in search of law, but an interpretive science in search of meaning. Related to this first myth is the second myth, that scientific research must be quantitative. So there are a number of scholars who are deeply wedded to quantitative methods, and good results have been produced using this range. A range of scientific practices, including but not limited to ethnographic research, collect and represent data in a qualitative fashion that is equally valid. Ethnography is less valid than quantitative research. At conferences and workshops, ethnographers sometimes find their work classified as statistically insignificant or inconclusive, with years of vigorous investigation disregarded in comparison to short-term, sometimes superficial forms of quantitative analysis. Now, as someone who has been going to conferences for a long number of years now and has lots of contact with people working in different areas, I know this to be this to be true. This is a very common criticism, and I guess it is very difficult to respond to people when they have had no experience of seeking to study a subjective, cultural, or historical, a social phenomenon. But let's read on. When compared to long-term ethnographic research, a sample gathered over a single month seems meagre. Was that particular month unusual? How does it reflect changes in activity over a longer time frame? Are there seasonal patterns or release dates to consider? Can we imagine a similar slice being taken from an ethnography missing, for example, the entire planting or harvesting in an agrarian or agricultural society, or the intensity and experimentation of a major game software expansion? So, for example, when you may or may not have watched the videos where I explain about the 20 odd visits that I have made to some research sites. And by going there more and more, we see the range of things that happen. So although some ethnographic research could potentially be superficial if it's just done in 1 month, long-term ethnographic fieldwork does respond to this concern about it not being as reliable as figures. This myth that ethnography is less valid than quantitative research is, of course, shaped by beliefs about validity itself. Validity denotes the extent to which a scientific explanation corresponds to the actual world. There are ways of having poor validity of numbers as well as having poor validity of qualitative data. This is a problem that both forms of research take. While researchers did not name the problem, while ethnographers did not name the problem, ethnography came into being precisely to create a research paradigm in which human beings can be studied with no fear of compromising ecological validity. Ethnographic practice is, in essence, the opposite of psychological experimentation. Ethnographers observe people in interaction with other people, with other humans and their social and physical contexts, which together compose the environmental supports. Our work has a high degree of validity because we as ethnographers directly observe and interact with what we want to know. We do not wrench phenomena out of their context, thereby rendering them uninterpretable. We must rely on qualitative methods of observation and conversation to absorb and analyze what is taking place around us. Validity is essential to science, most fundamental purpose to faith, to faithfully represent the world. We are arguing that qualitative research can yield profound insights that actually elude quantification or being able to count that. Ethnography is a flexible methodology, and ethnographers devise and use whatever tools are needed for the job. Although ethnographers emphasize qualitative methods, we may use quantitative approaches as well. Indeed, a cliche of anthropology is an ethnographer beginning his research in a remote village by conducting a census, and indeed that was what Malinowski did when he first arrived. Let's go to the issue of whether ethnography is simply anecdotal. An anecdote is just a short snippet of a larger story. It's just an anecdote. So let's just get this right, When crafting a book, article or research report, ethnographers formulate holistic analyses from their data that explores beliefs and practices within and between cultures, linking together materials from a large corpus. The data are typically collected in the field over a prolonged period. They represent not isolated incidences, but multiple incidences and manifestation of phenomena involving many different individuals observed in context. Ethnographic analysis involves a rigorous appraisal of a massive amount of data spanning participant observation, interviews, artifact collection, historical research, and content analysis. And so to accuse ethnographers of being anecdotal is a myth that should be denied. Ethnography is undermined by subjectivity. Another myth regarding ethnographic research is that it is compromised by the subjective viewpoint of the researcher. Ethnography is predicated on the idea that ethnographers produce work of high validity from situated engagement in the field. Each engagement is not subjective in the sense of being the opinion of one person, nothing more. Ethnography may appear more subjective because the materials it seeks to understand do not yield the prediction and control possible when objects of study exhibit little self-invention or far less dynamic or are amenable to experimental manipulation. Ethnographers are, in essence, tracking a moving target, one capable of continual acts of self-determination and creativity. Rather than to pretend to have a God's eye view of the world, it is more scientific to realize that science generates situated knowledge, and we are all situated. Subjectivity is actually a vital part of ethnographic vigor, not only for how it offers us a position from which to engage and interpret, but because it forms the backbone of intersubjective understanding. Is ethnography merely intuitive? Dispensing with methods to structure data in advance, engaging in participation without fixing the kinds of protocols we may use, can seem an abandonment of the order and precision that characterizes materials generated through hypothesis testing science. But to discover that it is happening in the field, that people actually do as what people actually do as they live their lives, unmindful of the analyst protocols, it is necessary to participate in the activities of a culture. It is out of such participatory exercises that we devise analytical protocols. The rigor that science cultivates is embodied in this approach. It is just that it arrives after the fact. Ethnographic research is intuitive in the same way that flying an aeroplane or doing brain surgery is intuitive once we know how to do them. Similarly, ethnographers develop a set of embodied intuitions for participant observation that far exceed those of everyday interactions. Ethnography is writing about your personal experience. This is related to the earlier point. Ethnography is an immersive, naturalistic methodology, but not all personal experience constitutes ethnography. We have occasionally heard people say they conducted an ethnography because they advanced a character in a game or spent 2 weeks hanging out in Second Life. These statements equate ethnography with simple experience rather than understanding it as a systematic method. Simply the recording of first-hand experience, it is a myth that writing about your own experience is the same thing as ethnography. This reduces ethnographic research to an exercise of data collection, to the consternation of many anthropologists. Let's just go down and address this very important myth that ethnographers contaminate field sites by their very presence. By their very presence, we have spoilt things. An ethnographer's arrival in the field may stir interest, attention, even excitement or trepidation. However, in maintaining a lengthy presence in the field, we normalise our presence by being on the scene, observing and participating in everyday activities. Malinowski noted, as the natives saw me constantly every day, they ceased to be interested or alarmed or made self-conscious by my presence, and I ceased to be a disturbing element in the tribal life which I was studying. What he meant was that the presence of such a person was no longer that of an outsider. In a simple sense, the outsider had become familiar and was no longer a disturbing element, which is an important way to respond. I think that is probably enough. Those are the most significant points in this article, and I don't want it to go on too long. And so these are some of the common myths that people make about ethnography. It is anecdotal, it's not scientific, it's less valid than quantitative research, it's subjective, it's just writing about your experiences, and we contaminate the field by our very presence. So thanks very much for watching. Maybe we could come out of full screen mode so that people could see where we are. So these are 10 interesting myths. Some of these responses you may have not thought about before. Maybe you come from a background of the physical science where you're interested in things that don't change, that are predictable. Maybe you have a real ability with numbers and you like the way that this helps you understand the world. The nice thing about this article, the way that it confronted these 10 myths, is that it reminds us about how terribly different so many of the cultural and social phenomenon that we study as social scientists who engage in a range of research methods to understand these phenomena. These are not predictable. These are not things that are predictable and they stay the same. And because of these important differences, we need to be more descriptive, and we need methods that are best suited to describe the phenomenon. Some phenomenon can be understood better through a mixture of numbers and words, but there are others where words are certainly words, and pictures and images are far more important. So I hope that you've enjoyed this. There's been some nice links again back to Malinowski and his methodological contributions. So stay tuned as we begin to drill deeper into the idea of ethnographic research. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again.